Okay. Right. Don't get a glass of water. Hey up. Right. So, Blender, OMSI. These are things which go together well. My Michelle. Boom, boom, boom. And because I only have one monitor, view streams off into the middle distance. Okay. My intention is to make a very simple building. So who have we got here? I'm expecting as much of the junior UKDT as possible to be here. Inspecting list. Currently unavailable. Please try again later. That's going well. These hours that go together well. My Michelle. Fuck now, 20 of you. Let's see if I can get a viewer list now. Huzzah, a viewer list. We suddenly have a Robin Ross, Antique Ink, yeah, we have Bog. We have numerous people. Excellent. Well. I'll tell you if that works in a moment. Yes. Okay. My plan is basically to make a house from start to finish. A very simple house. So, stage one is I would like somebody to give me a town. And I will then go and find a building. And then I will model that building in Blender. Explaining as I go. Pause for effect. / waiting. Pontypridd, that was the first one. Okay, now I'm going to go for somewhere out in estatey sort of places, which looks like, say, how's about here? That's got curvy roads and lots of them packed together, so that's probably an estatey kind of place. Yes, it is indeed. Marvellous. Now I need to see if I can find a house. So this is stage one if you aren't going to go out and get photo textures for yourself, is find a building in Street View that you will be able to make a reasonable texture out of. In this case, it might be 2 buildings. Also, let's have a quick list of the tools. We are going to be using GIMP 2, which is free, Paint.net, which is free, and Blender, which is free. So let's see if I can find one of these, which I can see the end of. Marvellous. So thing one I'm going to do is line up a reasonable screenshot of this. Pro tip, press F11 to increase the space that you take up on your monitor with the internet. Then I could use Gyazo, or yeah, let's use, no, let's not, because that's not something that everyone has. Let's just print screen it. And here we have the start of our texture. I might want to see if I can on in shade. Excellent. I might want to see if I can on in shade. Right, so the first thing we're going to do with this is we are going to go into GIMP. Having selected that particular image, so what I've done is I've just cropped down the image to this particular segment, taken it into this. Now I'm going to select the perspective tool, and I am going to select corrective. Now if I click on here I get this grid. I then drag the grid to a rectangle corresponding to the shape of the building, so you can see on the bottom here I'm following the courses of the brickwork. There you go. That is about right. For the ends of buildings, you do generally want a picture of the actual end of a building rather than just using a flat brick texture, which would work in theory, but with OMSI's lighting engine it doesn't. You really need to have the shading of the overhang in there. So there we go, that's our first step. One more just to get it a little bit neater. I think that will do. And we bring that back into Paint.net, which is where we will carry out any other edits that we make. At this point, I start doing lots and lots of very minor modifications to things to try and just make them a little more suitable for use in game. So for instance, in this case I have just copied across that top part. I've taken the good side of one part and taken it onto the bad side with the ridge over on this side. And now I'm using a very soft eraser tool just to blend the edges in, which works reasonably well for buildings that aren't going to be a centre of attention. Now, in this case, I also want to get rid of this as much as possible, this shaded area. So what I might try to do is just shift everything up a little bit, because this is the side of a building that was on a downhill slope, I believe. Let's head back in there. Right, where was the building we were working on? Oh, there's tons of them which I can see the side of down this end of the road. That was probably the one. That's the one. Yes, there it is. So yeah, there's a driveway sloping down there, so we can afford to lose a bit of height from that. Now here's another thing I'm quickly going to do is I'm just going to add a grid. Oh yeah, one other thing that I often use is, what's the name of that, what's the name of that plugin pack I use? There is a certain pack, yeah, bolt bait. This is a plugin pack that I use a lot. It is a free plugin pack, donationware, which adds a whole bunch of things to Paint.net, such as this, which is a color adjustment tool that allows you to only select certain bits of it that you want to adjust the color of. So if I select the whole thing, then it will do. I'm on the blank layer, which is why it's not doing anything, which is a terrible example. So now you can see that I'm only selecting the orange bits to change the colour of. Obviously I can also go along here and select there as well. Ta-da! Very useful tool. Then another tool which is quite useful, so if I just grab the canvas size, width 320, you can make a grid. Ta-da! And as Roadhog says, this is indeed not in proportion. Again, with this kind of building, it's not hugely important that you get everything perfectly lined up, but I'm just showing off the techniques that you use on this kind of thing. So that's a symmetrical building now, and as I mentioned previously, I would like to get rid of some of the shadow under there because it's a little bit exaggerated and look very odd from a lot of angles. You want to have as few shadows on buildings that you make as possible. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the lasso to select tool and effectively just drawing a straight line along one edge with it, which allows you to select things slightly more precisely. Now I should be incorporating some of this edge here into things because this is still going to be about right for the new position that we move it into. And how about let's collapse that into it properly, and then if we move this down to more like there, we get a reasonable result. Now we can get rid of that and then crop this to its new position. Come on. Thank you. Again, not perfect, but you're not going to notice that. And then also down here there's a shadow over here, so I'm just going to copy some bricks across there. You always want... The art of doing this is finding regions of it which are of a similar tone to the bit that you're replacing so that they blend in properly. I'm also going to get rid of the CCTV camera, so you can see that I'm selecting things from the same height along the brickwork as I go, because normally that excuse me, there we go. Always make sure you're working on the correct layer, because you can see that courses like this then continue along through there more nicely. And you just want to get rid of these harsh edges. Okay, so there we have a reasonable end on texture. Okay, yeah, probably a garden light. So, just for neatness' sake, I'm going to take this, select that region, and just fill it in grey, just because it's neater. And having done that, I noticed that these bits are nailed off, so again I'm just going to select that region, move it along, then use a large soft-edged eraser to blend the edges in, and you'd never know it was there. There we go. And that's the end texture for our building. I will just save these onto the desktop for the time being. There we go. Okay, and now we need a front texture. So for that, let's find a house that's relatively unobscured from the front view. No. Shrubberies are very annoying. If you want your house in OMSI, don't put shrubberies in front of it. Well, how about I use this one then? Right, so we've got another texture. Another thing you want to do when you're making your building textures is you want to make the colours match as best as possible. Which involves tweaking in the hue saturation tools. Again, on the correct layer. It's always easier to make a light texture darker than a dark texture lighter without making it look really just weird. Often you end up having to select individual bits of a texture at a time. So I reckon I'm going to have to down the hue and the saturation a little bit on this as well. Or just the saturation. Lightness and saturation is what I was going for. It'll do it. Okay, so now I'm going to use this to make two separate textures. I'm going to grab this bit. Obviously to make a tile texture. Discard that. Just Control V, paste it straight into it, no problems. And then again, just line this up according to the tiles. Same as we lined things up with the brickwork last time. And you may need 1 or 2 shots at it before you get a decent result, but that looks good to me. Then obviously it's out of proportion. Yeah, that reveals that it is actually quite a long way out. Roof tile textures only need to be very simple because, well, they're on roofs. You're not really looking at them very much from the driver's perspective. So what I just did there was I reselected the whole thing so that I was only working on the area that I wanted to be working on, rather than then distorting it again from where it had distorted to the first time, which means I could line the grid back up to it properly again. So the only requirement we've got about this roof tile texture really is that it needs to loop properly. So we need to be able to rise over itself and join it on at the end without artifacts or anything that we don't particularly want. There we go. So what I'm going to do to that effect, because this is a very simple texture, is I'm just going to grab that to approximately the centre. This won't work for all textures, but for this one it'll work perfectly well. Copy that across to there, like that, and then erase everything except the very edge of it. Let's see how that turns out. That will probably look just fine. Always keep your textures named such that you know what they relate to. Then the other thing I'm going to do is I can tell this is going to look a bit odd in game, so I'm just going to drop the brightness on it down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to black and white, then whack up the brightness and the contrast of it. Because that, for roof tiles, is a very reasonable way of making a snow texture. Okay, so we've done that. Now we're going to crop this section together. This has a few interesting things that we're going to have to edit out on it. So let's see how this goes. First, again, we're going to paste it into GIMP, and we're going to correct the perspective. That's always the first step. Again, just keeping the grid lines lined up as well as you can with any features that you can line it up with that you know are running vertically or horizontally. That's a little bit off, it looks to me. Looks like I got this corner slightly off. A little bit of distortion can have a surprising effect in game. Yeah, see, this line along here is not quite lined up with this course of bricks, which means it's going to be slightly distorted. I suspect that the house is on a slight slope, which isn't helping. Yeah, look. Yes, the house is on a slight slope, which isn't helping because I was lining it up to the bottom of the house as opposed to actual level. Ignore that. That was an attempt that I had at making my computer automatically turn itself off. It didn't work very well. I've never bothered to get rid of it. There we go. At some point I should be able to go over that, yes. At some point being the key part of that. Okay, so again, most of what I do to fix textures is I just take bits of the texture that aren't broken and paste them over the bit that is. Like this. Ta-da, fixed garage door. Mostly. I'm going to have to do a little bit more tweaking around here. Yeah, I let the car's bumper show through a little there, that didn't go very well. There we go, fixed garage door. Then I should just be able to take... In fact, let's just brush this down here a little to make that edge a little bit nicer. Then if I take this section here, notice I'm creating a new layer every time I do things like that. That's so that I can just erase bits that I don't want as I'm going along. It means that if I erase a bit off here like that, I can let the layer beneath show through. Which means that I can soften up the join between the edges. And yes, this isn't perfect, however, it's a minor detail on a minor building, so you don't need to worry about it too much. So there you go, there's the garage door fixed. Evening, Crazy Squirrel. And yes, that's the thing you have to be particularly aware of when you're taking your own pictures, but with Streetview images I've found it hasn't been such a problem. Right, so along here we have plant pots. Lots and lots of plant pots. We don't want these plant pots. So what we're going to have to do is, this is going to be slightly difficult because there isn't a large area of bricks here that I can select and use to cover up defects. So we're just going to have to see what happens. This is going to be slightly difficult. That ought to work perfectly well. There we go. That's working out reasonably well. Yep, that's working out reasonably nicely. We have got a little bit of repeated texture going along over here, but it's not too severe, and that's a part of the building that's likely to be covered anyway. That's another thing with building creation, is know when the thing that you're doing isn't actually going to make a difference. That's the thing with creation of most things in for OMSI. Or most things in life even. There's a philosophical lesson for you. Work out what does and doesn't matter. But you can see that, having noticed that, I'm now trying to choose positions for these bricks such that they tile properly, but also don't repeat. At least not too obviously. Right, having done that, I can collapse all these layers down onto each other. There we go, and now I just have one solid block of bricks. This I can get rid of reasonably effectively just by grabbing something like that and dragging it along, or if I select the right layer, just doing something like that. It doesn't have to be a complex solution. If it looks right, it's absolutely fine. There we go. I'll probably deal with these as well. Still appears to be fine on my end. Yep, there we go. And then this will probably be sufficient just to paint it. From that distance, you're not gonna care. Okay, so that works out perfectly well. If you do end up with a result like that, where if you do end up with a tiling texture, one thing that you can do is you can stick a little grunge map over it. A grunge map is basically a layer of filth that you can stick on top of something. If you apply one subtly, such as this one, which I have used quite a bit, well, if I remember to log in. It can just help to break things up a little when you've got a very consistent looking texture. And there we go. So, about, there's that down. And that ought to be a reasonable texture, unless we want to get rid of the satellite dish, which we might as well, really. Let's see, maybe this segment will do us. Maybe not. How's about this bit over here? It's a slightly different colour. You'd be surprised how much the colour varies across one image of the same building. Damn it. I could just remove this cable altogether. And the shadow of it, thinking about it, that would be a reasonable thing to remove. Looks like using this is a reasonable solution, actually. Yeah, the texture on that actually matches up quite nicely. Hey, remember your layers, kids. Looks like this one's going to work out better if I reverse it, because that's a slight downward slope going on there. There we go. Promise you'll get into Blender shortly. But this step is very important. Because in OMSI, if you don't get layers, in OMSI, if you don't get your textures right, you're not going to get very far. There we go. And again, just for neatness' sake. I'm just going to select these edges. New layer, and just fill it in grey. Just to keep the texture tidy. No reason other than that. Right. Let's get rid of that from there. Then one thing that I note on this is that this has quite a dull, slightly creamy grey texture going on, whereas this is bright white. So I'm just going to pull a sample of that colour into here. Then I'm going to, I wonder if I might be able to there we go. Now let's see. There we go. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to resize these textures appropriately. Now what I'm resizing them to here is powers of 2. So these, both of these are a 2 to the n size. So I cannot remember what that is. I think that's 2 to the 8. I can't remember. And I'm sure Roadhog can tell you why that is useful. I have some vague idea of why it's useful. I'm going to do that for all the textures we made. You might notice I've already set that to 128 by 128. Okay, so now we have our textures. Having made them, we can now start blendering. The first thing we're going to do, if you didn't already know, let us find the house again. That's the one. If you didn't already know, in Google Maps you can measure distances, which is very useful for modelling things for OMSI. So we've got 8.22 meters that way and about 9 odd meters that way. Keep in mind that the building's sort of skewed slightly over there. Okay, so now Blender. First tab tab takes you from object mode into edit mode. In object mode, you're moving around objects. You can see each object has an origin. This origin is something that you can place at coordinates in the world. But generally for OMSI you want the origin to be on 0. Then in edit mode, you edit the individual vertexes and faces. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to delete the face underneath this, because you're never going to see that in OMSI, so I might as well just get rid of it. Then I'm going to set the height of this to 0 for ground level. Note that it'll move the average of these points to that height, so if I now put all of them at 0, it won't do anything. The reason why I didn't do that, Road Dog, is because one of these houses has an extension. Notice, this house has been extended by this much, and that's the one I made the texture from. Though actually, looking at it, the texture I've made will be equally useful for any of these houses, because I can just ignore everything beyond this point. So from this I can actually make 2 houses. So bonus. Then what I just did there was I hit S for scale, Z for Z axis, and 0 for scale it all to 0. And because the median of these points, or the average of these points, was on 0, they've all ended up flat on 0, which is very convenient. What I'm going to do now is, in fact I think what I'm going to do now is scale everything such that we got ourselves a building of approximately the right size. So what are the dimensions of this object currently? It is a 2 by 2 meter cube. So if I move this to minus 4.5, 4.5, there we go. In fact, let's show you a slightly different technique to what I was originally intending to do. Let's move this face to 0, delete it, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mirror modifier to it. Now on a mirror modifier you can select which axis you want to mirror around. We want to mirror across the x-axis. So now what I can do, so if I do that, we've got a peaked roof. Except obviously everything's massively out of proportion. Then what we do is we guess how high the house is, which requires guesswork. So that doorway is going to be in the region of 2 meters high. So we've got about 2 meters, 2 meters, maybe 5 meters until the roof starts sloping. So if we put this to in the correct axis, height of 5, there you go, we've got that. Then what we're going to do, in fact, would this be a good time to bring in background images? Now let's leave that for now. I can eyeball this for the time being. We're keeping it simple. Then what I'm going to do is that. So now we have a peaked roof. There are many other ways you can do this. There's no wrong or right way to do it. This is just the way I happen to have chosen to do it. So now I am going to quickly apply this modifier outside of edit mode. And you can see this is all now one thing, and this is all joined together down the middle, so I can just move that around. It moves both those faces around. And now we've got a box. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 2 faces, then I'm going to hit 5, then I think 3, yes, 3 is the correct one. So on the numpad you've got view keys. 5 turns perspective on and off, 1 lets you view it from this end, 3 lets you view it from this end, 7 lets you view it from this end, and 9 inverts whatever view you're in. So I'm going to select from this point of view. So now what I'm going to do is some UV mapping. So you can see that I've dragged this handle here to make a new window. I can get rid of that new window just by doing this I drag and triangle in the corner to make a new window. I'm just going to put those away to make things a little bit easier to see. Then I change it to a UV/image editor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my image file, which I stored on the desktop. Ta-da! And now I'm going to fit these points to the building. And you can use... this is the thing I haven't mentioned. I've just realised this is quite important. Is if you are moving something, so if I select something, press G to move it. While you're moving it, if you press Y, X, or Z if you're in the 3D mode, you lock it to certain axes. And then if you press Shift Y or Shift X or Shift Z, you lock it to the other two axes, which means that you can move things around in the plane. So for instance, if I select this face here and do G, Shift Z, I can now move it around just horizontally and not vertically at all. Hopefully that makes sense. So now we've made a UV map for those sides. That's all we need to do. However, we've got this bit here, which we're going to have to do something about, aren't we? So, there are always multiple ways you can go about doing anything in Blender. Absolutely anything. You can go about it in however many ways you want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this bunch of edges here, hit W, and I'm going to subdivide it. And then I'm going to use 3 cuts, and that'll do me just fine. Then I'm going to hold Alt and Select to select that loop, and then holding Shift to select those loops. I'm going to move them over here. Now, unfortunately, because I don't have a background texture, I'm going to have to eyeball it. Off the top of my head, I can't actually remember if you can rescale background images in multiple directions, because it's not something I've ever had to do, because I always use buildings that are in proportion already. So let's find out. Yeah, you can only change the size of it. So background images are images that you can bring in to help you line things up. You can move them around, move them left and right. You can flip them, but as it turns out, you can't rescale them in different directions at the same time, which is irritating. However, I am going to be able to use this as a horizontal guide for what I'm doing, which is perfectly fine by me. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Z. That puts me into transparent mode. And then I'm going to line this up to the corners of this. So there I was holding Control down so I can do a loop select, or whatever you want to call it. It is a selection mode. I use it a lot. Marvellous. So we now have that. Now let's think about how we're going to go about the rest of this. There's always more than one way you can do it. What do I want to do today? How do I want to do this? Well, let's get rid of this side again, because we can remake that with a mirror modifier later. Never make more work than for yourself if you don't have to. So, I mean, one thing I can very simply do is just move this upwards, which quickly reveals that my building is somewhat out of proportion and that I haven't lined things up very well manually previously. So if I just pull the roof down to about there-ish. Again, I'm just eyeballing all of this at the moment. There we go. We now have that. Now, what's going to be the best way to do this? Let's try something. something such as that. So now if I were to do that, and that, and then if I subdivide this edge and this edge, then I get two lovely points there. Then if I slide them up there, so that was G and then G again, for those of you keeping score. We can roll this up here. Now Rotor will be cringing at me at the moment because I'm not doing this precisely. Now can I? Aha! Indeed I can. Marvellous, that's now lined up precisely. And now I can just line this up like that. So what I did there was I turned snaps on, and then I told it to snap to the closest vertex. So now you can see that's positioned in there. It is exactly in the right place. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these, Alt-M at last, and that merges these two vertices together. I'm going to select these two, Alt-M at last, merges those two together. And then I'm going to select all of these and merge them together at the centre. So now, if I go out of Z, we have something like this. Now if I select this bunch of faces along here, then 5 and 3 to get us into an appropriate view to UV map. What I can do now is if I go into shading / UVs, I can do unwrap, project from view, and I now project that shape onto here. So now I can very simply scale things into place. You can see as I've made that peak much too sharp. So I'm going to have to alter that on the model, which is it's going to be slightly annoying, but not hugely annoying. And the magnet always works if you know what you're doing with it. Did I just say it was too sharply peaked and then move it further along? Now here's a limitation of this, is I can only slide it along an edge with the GG tool, which is going to be minorly irritating. Because if I move this down, I'm going to distort the whole roof. That's minorly annoying. 2K16. I mean, I could just line it up manually. This doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, so I could just do that, and then G, lock it to the X, and do that. And just get as close as I can. And that'll work just fine. It's always best to do things precisely if you can do them precisely, but at the same time it's not worth making your life any more difficult. So let's try this one. Ah yes, since I've turned snaps on in this view, they're also on in this view. So I'm going to turn them back off again, and you notice that that turned off for both views, which is slightly annoying. Now that is a reasonably good fit. So now if you want a preview of what that's going to look like, you can turn this into texture mode, though you will need a light source in an appropriate location, such as here. And there you go. That's the start of a texture building, putting it back into perspective mode. And like I mentioned earlier, put a mirror on it, and then we just get the exact same over the other side, and it just means we don't have to do all the work twice. So now, let's have a quick look at the end of the building, because I feel like my measurements were a little bit off. Oh no, maybe not. No, okay. Well, maybe it's a little bit off. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select everything with just pressing A. Then I'm just going to hold Shift, select that vertex to deselect it, select it again. Now what I'm going to do is change this from median point to active element. So now if I rotate things or move them, it's going to move around that point and not around the median point of all of these points. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale it in the X, and it just scales around that, which means it still perfectly lines up. I'm going to put it back into solid view because I don't want to have to deal with lighting engines properly. Now I'm just going to apply that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into edit mode. When you're rotating and scaling things, you want to do it in edit mode ideally, because sometimes you get issues with where the origins of things are, such as OMSI thinking that things are still supposed to be related to their sort of internal origin as to the world origin, which can cause problems. So again, just projecting a UV map from this view, opening up the end of our building, and scale it to fit, and look, we got that reasonably close. Not quite, but fairly close. This should be close enough in proportion that I might be able to get away with just doing that. We'll see. That will have distorted the texture slightly, but we'll see how bad it is and whether I'm going to have to need to do anything about it in the texture editor. I suspect I will do. Yeah, you can see it along the edge of the polygons. We've got a bit of distortion going on, which isn't very nice. So I will undo that. Now another thing you can do if you've got something like this is you can project a view to bounds. This just means that you have slightly less scaling to worry about. Now let's see, how much more am I going to need to add to this to make it fit properly. Round about that. Okay, so we go back into Paint, open up this texture again, then I'm just very simply going to copy a course of bricks from one place, adjust the canvas size, about that much should do it. There we go. Then once again I am going to resize this to 512 vertically, save it. Then I am going to just reload it, that ought to deal with it. There we go. Whoop. And there you go. We now have a building that's textured on the front and the sides. So now what I'm going to do is add on the roof tiles for that. The way that I do that is like this. And then I just scale this up by like so, and we end up with a bunch of roof tiles. You can see that's out of proportion. So if I just select all of them again, I just scale it horizontally and they widen out a bit. And there we go. Roof tiles. Nice and simple. And then these, I'm going to do them in a very similar way, which is I'm going to project them from this end. Now, one important thing you need to know is that this window you're seeing here on the right, the text you select in this is not the texture that's being applied to it in OMSI, which is confusing and annoying. There we go. I can do that a little bit more neatly. Yeah. So that looks perfectly good. However, what you will see in OMSI is this, which is completely and utterly blank. So now we're going to have to assign those textures to it as materials, which is the step that confuses me. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to go back into edit mode, select everything that's going to be one texture. So I'm holding down shift and this. If you didn't already know, if you hold down shift and right click, you select additional faces. If you hold down control and right click, you select additional faces and all the ones in between. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. Then I'm going to add a new material. Now I tend to do one material per texture. One thing you want to do for all the materials, except in very specific cases, is turn specular down to 0, because that makes things look daft and shiny in OMSI. So we have this. Now what we're going to do is click this tab here, get rid of the auto-generated one, add new, open, then navigate to the texture that you want, and there you have it. Then when you have selected faces, you can assign it like that. I tend to do one material per texture just because it keeps things a little bit easier for me. So now if we go into material mode, you can see that this whole thing has that material on. So now we make a new one, call it end. Turn the specular down to 0. New texture, open. In fact, it's probably a better idea. So now I'm going to assign it, and it's only assigning it to those faces. What's probably a better idea is to name it the same as the texture file name. So and then the whole roof. There we go. Another new texture. Again, specular down to 0. Then we just open up that and assign it, and there you go. That'll now appear in OMSI in that form. So that's the completed building. Save it. Yeah, it's not getting the capitalization the same because of reasons of it's annoying now that you've pointed it out to me. Also, that's C, not B. Let's just neaten these up. It makes it nicer when you come back. There you go, I've even put them in order for you. There we go. Nice neat Blender file. Now what we're going to do is export it. Now when you export things, you need to make sure that these settings down here in this corner, this lot, are these settings, basically, because otherwise things are going to show up very strangely in OMSI. Now what I've done as a bonus tip is I have delved deep inside Blender's option settings and found the Python file which deals with this, and change these settings so that they initialize as these settings. If you haven't done that, these are not going to be correct when you load up Blender. I will quickly see if I can remember how I did that. Right. Yeah. IO export, was it DXF? No, it's IO scene X. Then init.py. And this sets all the initial values for everything. So here I have just set all of these options to these particular options. It's quite self-explanatory. Like, for instance, export UV coordinates true, that kind of thing. True, yada yada. It's very simple to make the modifications that you need to do. And then I will just export it, as I tend to get rid of the .blend in the name because it seems messy. And there we go, that's exported. Now what I'm going to do is go into OMSI. Remember that that's not the OMSI file that I've got all my developer tools in. Then OMSI X converter. And there we go. It's so simple that it did it that quickly that I thought that it hadn't done it. Cubic doke face. Now if we go back onto the desktop, we have our O3D file, which is very, very simple. In fact, it's so simple that it hasn't actually exported anything. The reason why is because I hadn't actually selected the building before I exported it. So if you have export selected objects only selected, then it will only export the selected objects rather than the entire scene. I had not selected anything. So let's just try that again. And let's open a new File Explorer window so that it makes it a little bit easier. Right, so children house I want, there we go, and as you can see it's got the correct texture names in. So now we can turn this into a scenery object. Let's put it in, I'm going to put it in this folder. So in the model file. Okay, so now let's start from scratch. Let's make a new folder inside scenery objects and start from scratch. So inside that folder you need a model folder, and you need a texture folder, then that texture folder, in this case you want a winter snow folder, and what is the name of the night map folder? I cannot remember for the life of me. It is not in this folder. Night. There you go. If you have these folders with a texture with the same name as a texture outside that folder, then it'll use the texture inside this folder if it's fall, winter, spring, night. You get the general picture. So now if I nip back out to this, grab my winter snow texture, stick it in here, and grab these textures, stick it in the general texture folder, then I grab the model, put it in the model folder, then what I normally do, this is a bit of a cheeky way of doing things but it works just fine, is just take the SCO file from an object that I know is comparable and then rename it to my purposes. Because that means you don't have to faff around with the tags so much. So in your SCO file you have a few different tags, Under groups, this is how it'll be shown in the file directory tree in the editor. It's not shown in the same folders that it's in File Explorer. It's in its own brand new system. So I'm just going to give it 1 tutorial house 01, and the mesh is this name here. Ta-da! And that's all you need to do for an SEO file. That's it. You can mess around with some bits and bobs depending on what you're doing. If you want more advanced, like reflective textures, that kind of thing, then you need to do a lot more work than this. But generally, to make a basic scenery object that works, this is all you need. The complexity of it defines when it's going to show up. So if you set it to 2, that's the minimum. That means it'll only show up if you're on maximum complexity settings in OMSI. If it's 0, it'll always be there. It's a house. You don't want houses to go missing if people are playing on lower settings, like they did in Farthington before I patched it. So that'll do us just fine. Now that should work, basically. There isn't anything else that needs to be done to that. But I'm quickly going to do one more thing that I've remembered I forgot to do, which is making a night map, which I haven't done for a little while. So what I'm going to do is set this to black and white. This is a technique I developed a little while back. Set it to black and white. Invert it. Then I'm going to paint this layer. I'm going to fill it yellow. Where has my toolbar gone? It is there. And make it very pale, like so. And then I'm going to make a new layer. Box, black, filled shape. And then fill in all the regions that aren't going to be lit up. So what this will do is it will overlay over the top of the normal texture when the night map is active. Which means that at night the windows will light up. You do not want to have any of the rest of the texture anything other than pure black, because if it is, then the rest of the building will start glowing in the night as well. This doesn't have to be perfect, and I tend to drop the resolution of it a little bit compared to the main texture, and I'm going to ignore the door. In fact, you don't want to colour in all the windows, because otherwise the houses will just be lit up like a Christmas tree at night. So I'm just going to do that. Compress that down to there, compress that down to there. Actually no, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to blur the edges of this very slightly, just so it isn't such a harsh edge. And then I'm going to resize it to about half the size, because it doesn't need to be a particularly detailed map. Then I'm going to save it in here with the same file name. There we go. And one more thing that you can do is if you copy a texture and rename it exactly the same but with underscore hashtag low at the end of the name, then if you tick use only low res textures in OMSI, it'll use this texture instead. So if I set this one to 256 by 256, then if you tick that option, it'll use this texture instead of the bigger texture, which saves a bit of memory. So it's not necessary, but it's a nice thing to do. Generally about half will do for a texture size. There are some buildings you don't want to do this with. Okay, so now we have what should be a working building ready to place. Missing executable, eh? Interesting. Well, I'm just going to double check that this is the version I was working in. Does it have tutorial at the top? Yes. This is a trick a lot of developers use, which is to have multiple OMSI installs, and you rename the one that you want to use at the moment to OMSI 2, or just make shortcuts to all of them. And I forgot to rename any of them to OMSI 2, so Steam couldn't see that the game was installed at all, because it only knows to look in one place for it. So I'm just going to load up Grundorf, because it loads fast. There we go. That is a very bad skybox mod that only works when you're looking in one direction. I haven't been able to find the really nice skybox mod that I used a while ago. It's really annoying. But this is a bit of a messed up install because I basically conglomerated all of my various installs into one place because they were getting a bit out of hand. And now I have this one hugely messed up install and one nearly clean install. Anyway, here we go. You can see it's appeared under tutorial and nothing else. And if I place it, there you go, a building. It is a perfectly ordinary house with a slightly blurry side texture because the texture I started with wasn't the best. And this side's texture is missing, which will be because I didn't apply it in Blender properly. But anyway, if we just test the rest of it. Daytime, nighttime, there you go. Night map works. Whee, there goes the scene. And then day of year. Well, just snow. Ta-da! Snowy roof tiles. That technique works surprisingly well. Okay. So now if we nip back into Blender. Load the same house up again. It was this end that didn't have a texture applied to it. So if we just go into the texture list, get the appropriate one, assign it, then bring this across here to check. No. Ah, did I forget to UV map this one at the same time as this one? I think I did. Okay. There we go. Put that back away again. Open this back up as a UV editor. Then select that. There we go. And export it again. Yes, it is always best to save it as a .blend as well as a .x. If you don't save it as a .blend, then you can't really edit it anymore. So I've converted that again, replace the model with the new one, nip back into the editor and see if it's worked. When the editor decides to show its face. Ah, was that me launching Blender instead of OMSI? Might have been. It might be 0:30 in the morning. Now what I've done there is I have once again forgotten to select the house before exporting it. So now we have an empty X file. Go me. a lot of things you can do wrong. This time, I'm just going to leave these 2 windows open because I don't trust I haven't done it wrong again. It's easier if you don't have to reopen everything every time you do it wrong. Thank you, Rotok. I'm glad that my talents are appreciated. There we go, it's back. And this time it has a texture on both ends. Ta-da! In fact, I think I might be running with use only low-res textures on. Yes, so you can see this is currently using the low-res versions of the textures, which is why everything's a bit blurry, especially on the ends. So if I just turn that off, then it won't do anything for now because it's not going to do anything until it reloads that, I don't think. Let's just see what happens. So I'm going to put one at another end of the map which had not yet loaded. Does that look any more high res to you? No, it doesn't. It probably needs to restart the game to do it anyway. But there you go. A house. Huzzah. A house with snow on it. In the night. Okay. So, that is pretty much all you need to know to start building buildings for OMSI. This is obviously a very simple, fairly crude building, but hopefully you've seen a few things that you can do to make them, and particularly the textures I hope that you'll find useful. Meshes are very easy to make, there's no right or wrong way to make them, just make them however you think will be the right way. This bit up here, I'm sure I could have handled this differently. I could have just made a separate mesh altogether, which I've done before. That would have worked just fine, so just like a single triangular extrusion that I pushed through there and lined up precisely with the ends. With the magnetic snap tool, you can do that just fine, there's no reason you shouldn't do that, and it would actually have been easier to edit it after I made the changes before. But at the end of the day, if it looks fine in OMSI, then it is fine. There's nothing particularly special or difficult about it. Just make a house. Make an anything. From that foothold, particularly if you get your head over the textures, which was a thing that was a bit of a stumbling block for me for a long time, you can start building anything. Okay. Well, I hope that you found it useful anyway. Hopefully we'll start seeing some people making their own buildings in the near future. Thanks for tuning in. Ta-ra.